Well, I was wondering if you could speak to us about, what started to happen in the 1780s. You started to mention the Enlightenment, and we were talking about different approaches when critical scholarship really started to arise. I'm interested, perhaps at this point, especially for the listeners and viewers, to understand where typical divisions are among contemporary scholars. How did they see the book of Isaiah divided? What is a predominant critical view in terms of seeing different portions of the book, and how did they arise or arrive, I should say, at those particular conclusions?
Yeah, one of the things we can say is that predominant critical view doesn't actually exist. Every individual scholar is going to differ in a number of ways. There's general camps, and I'll talk about two of those here in a few minutes. There's general camps, but there is no consensus among critical scholars about how the book came into existence. But back to the beginning, what you're saying, and the first major movement toward considering Isaiah as coming from someone other than the prophet Isaiah happened in the 1780s with two guys, Doderlane and Eichhorn. And what Doderlane and Eichhorn did is they were reading the book of Isaiah, and they began to argue that there are two different historical horizons presented within the book. They would say that Isaiah 1 to 39, it has been termed Proto-Isaiah, presents an historical horizon of an Assyrian context, so the context of Isaiah's own life. However, what they term Deutero-Isaiah, chapters 40 to 66, they say presents a Babylonian context. And so the initial argumentation for diversity of Isaianic authorship was that there are two different historical horizons for the book, one Assyrian, one Babylonian. And what they would say about that is that the second half of the book, Isaiah 40 to 66, does not predict. It does not look forward to the Babylonian exile and a Babylonian context. It assumes it. And so it says, since it does not predict the Babylonian exile, but assumes it, it had to have been written later, right? Because the Babylonian exile was after the time of Isaiah, thinking 586 here versus 740. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so these different horizons, they would say, is the initial assumption. And think back to the historicism and things like that we're talking about before. So what they're saying is that a prophet has to be a reflection of their social and cultural context. And since the Assyrian context, if Isaiah is in an Assyrian context, talking about Babylon doesn't reflect his historical context. And so if they're talking about Babylon, it has to come later, when Babylon would have been a major world power, when it was coming up against Judah and the southern kingdom there. So that view of a prophet who reflects society plays over into this, where they have to reflect their particular context. Now, there's two ironic points about this. One, Babylon is actually mentioned explicitly more times in Isaiah 1 to 39 than Isaiah 40 to 66. In Isaiah 1 to 39, Babylon is mentioned 9 times explicitly. In Isaiah 40 to 66, he's mentioned twice. Babylon's mentioned twice. So 1 to 39, I think, has a pretty clear Babylonian message as well, especially Isaiah 13 and 14 and the prophecy, again, the oracle against the nation of Babylon. Now, later critical scholars have a response to that. They'd say it was redacted and added later. But we're in the 1780s, right? And so this was the initial perspective, that 1 to 39 presented an Assyrian context, and then 40 to 66 a Babylonian one. So after they began arguing this way, they began to look at these two books, Proto and Deutero-Isaiah, and they began to say, and scholars shortly after them, that these two halves reflect two different theological perspectives. So the two historical horizons have two different theological views. For example, in Isaiah 1 to 39, there's a lot of discussion about this royal figure from the line of David, Isaiah chapter 11, who is going to redeem the people, Emmanuel, in Isaiah 7 to 9. However, in the second half of the book, 40 to 66, they would say that royal figure, Emmanuel figure, is replaced with a servant figure. And so they would say these two provide two different theological portraits of the book. One a servant, or one a servant, the other a king. Another one is they would say that the first half of the book, chapters 1 to 39, has a particular emphasis on the holiness of the Lord, whereas 40 to 66 has a particular emphasis on the universal dominion of the Lord. So I don't know about you, when I read Isaiah 2 and the discussion of the day of the Lord there,
Yeah.
I fail to see how that's not universal. And the same thing, in terms of what's in Isaiah 40 to 66, there's tons of discussion about the holiness of the Lord. And even in terms of the servant versus royal figure, the servant of the Lord and the royal redeemer in the first part of the book are actually discussed in very similar ways. I mentioned Isaiah 11 a minute ago in terms of, Isaiah 11, 1 and 2 talks about a root and a shoot, springing forth from David. And it, springs to mind something that comes up in Isaiah 53 on how the suffering servant is one who does what? Who shoots forth from dry ground. Actually, the exact same term is used there in terms of the shoot springing forth. So I think that, in terms of those brief things, the servant figure is the royal figure.
Mm-hmm.
The suffering servant of Isaiah 53 just further explains the way that this royal son is going to come forth. And it's going to come forth not in terms of, victory, march, and glory, but in humiliation and suffering. Which, by the way, the royal figure actually comes back just a few verses later after Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 55, where the everlasting covenant is established with the Son of David. So all of these things go together there. And that, a third and final thing that they begin to do is say that the different theology, the different historical horizons also represent a different vocabulary, a different syntax in different parts of the book. Now, I think this discussion, this third one, has been rendered quite dubious by both sides here. As I mentioned quite a while ago now, recognizing how Isaiah's ministry covered 40 years of his life, and his book reflects that as well, is enough to show that there would be changes in topic, changes in vocabulary. Or even that there is a change in genre. Isaiah 1 to 39 has a lot of historical narrative type stuff in it. Isaiah 40 to 66 is almost entirely poetic and lyrical. But change in genre has a change in syntax and a change in vocabulary as well.